8 miles east of St. Louis, across the Mississippi River in the flat bottomland of southern Illinois. There is a hill that should not be there. The land around it is river floodplain, flat, alluvial, unremarkable. And rising out of it is a terraced earthen mound roughly 100 feet high, with a base covering around 14 acres. That footprint is larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is not a natural hill. It was built by hand, basket by basket, out of an estimated 14 to 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried on the backs of human beings. And it is only the largest of what were once well over 100 mounds spread across the surrounding landscape. This was a city. At its height, around the year 1100, it was home to something in the range of 10 to 20,000 people, with more in the surrounding settlements. That made it larger than London at the same date. It was the largest urban center north of Mexico, and it would remain so until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 1700s. It had planned neighborhoods, a vast central plaza, elite residential compounds, and an enormous circle of upright wooden posts that tracked the movement of the sun. It sat at the center of a trade network pulling in copper from the Great Lakes, marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachians. We call it Cahokia, a name borrowed from a much later people who had nothing to do with building it. We do not know what its own inhabitants called it. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called themselves, and by around 1350, they were gone. The city was empty. Today, we're examining what was built there, what the archaeology shows about how it ended, and why the most important question about the largest ancient city in North America still does not have an agreed answer. To understand the scale of what happened at Cahokia, you have to understand how fast it happened. For centuries, the region held scattered farming villages, substantial but ordinary. Then, in the middle of the 11th century, something changed dramatically. Archaeologists sometimes call it the Big Bang of Cahokia, because the transformation was so rapid and so total. Within a generation or two, the settlement pattern reorganized completely. A massive central plaza was laid out, and not simply cleared but engineered. Surveys have shown the ground was deliberately leveled and filled to create a flat public space of around 50 acres. Monumental mound construction began on an enormous scale. Population surged, apparently including large numbers of people moving in from surrounding regions. The construction was extraordinary in both scale and organization. The largest structure, now called Monk's Mound, was built in stages over several centuries. Rises in 4 terraces, and on its summit stood a large building, presumably the residence of the ruling authority, or a temple, or both. Standing on top of it, a person would have looked out across the entire city. Around it, mounds served different purposes. Some were platforms for buildings, some were ridge-topped and associated with burials. They were arranged in relation to the plaza and to each other with clear intent. To the west of the main mound, the city built something else, a great circle of massive red cedar posts set in a precise arrangement. Reconstructed by archaeologists and now called Woodhenge, it functioned as a solar calendar. From a central observation post, specific perimeter posts aligned with the sunrise at the equinoxes and solstices. The alignments are deliberate and accurate. Whoever built it was tracking the year with care, almost certainly for agricultural and ceremonial timing. And the city was not merely large, it was connected. Excavations have recovered copper from the Lake Superior region, whelk and lightning whelk shell from the Gulf Coast, sheets of mica from the southern Appalachians, and stone from sources hundreds of miles distant. Cahokian influence in pottery styles, in ceremonial objects, and settlement organization shows up at sites scattered across the mid-continent, as far north as present-day Wisconsin. Something was radiating outward from this place. Whether that was an empire, a religious movement, a trade hegemony, or something we do not have a good category for, is itself debated. Then there is the discovery that complicates any romantic reading of the city, and it needs to be handled honestly. Before we continue, if you enjoy documentaries that examine forgotten history through archaeology and original records, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep making investigations like this one. Because in the 1960s, excavation of one relatively modest ridgetop mound revealed something that changed how archaeologists understood the entire site. The mound is designated Mound 72. It is small compared to the Great Platform Mounds, but what it contained has shaped every discussion of Cahokia since. Excavation revealed a series of burials, deposited over a period of time, associated with what appears to have been an elaborate ceremonial program. At the center was a high-status burial, an individual laid on a platform of thousands of shell beads, arranged in a shape often described as a bird. Nearby were caches of exceptional grave goods, hundreds of finely made arrow points and styles, sourced from distant regions, sheets of mica, rolled copper, and piles of unused materials that represented an enormous investment of labor and long-distance exchange. But surrounding these central burials were mass graves. The excavation identified groups of individuals interred together in ways that indicate they died as part of the ceremonial events rather than from natural causes. including large groups of young women buried in layered pits, and a group of individuals whose remains show evidence of violent death. The total number of individuals recovered from the mound runs to more than 250. Interpretations have been debated and revised over the decades since and continue to be. Early readings emphasized a single paramount ruler and retainer sacrifice. More recent analyses, including reassessment of the sex and age composition of the burials and study of strontium isotopes indicating that many of the individuals were not local to Cahokia, have complicated that picture considerably, and have pushed some researchers toward interpretations centered on ceremonial and cosmological programs rather than straightforward royal burial. What is not seriously disputed is the core fact. Cahokia had a social order capable of organizing the deaths of substantial numbers of people as part of public ritual, and of drawing individuals from distant communities into that process. This matters for the collapse question because it tells us the city was not simply large, it was hierarchical, ideologically intense, and capable of exercising extraordinary power over human lives. Institutions like that can accomplish remarkable things. They can also generate remarkable resentment. Cahokia's decline was not sudden. It was a drawn-out unraveling across roughly a century and a half, and the archaeology records it in stages. Around the 12th century, the city built a palisade, a massive defensive wall of upright logs, enclosing the central precinct including Monk's Mound and the plaza. It was rebuilt several times. Estimates of the timber required run to around 20,000 logs per construction. You do not build that unless you're worried about something alongside. The palisade, the archaeology shows other signs of strain. Outlying settlement patterns shifted. Evidence of conflict increases in the wider region. Population began to decline. Mound construction slowed and then stopped. Neighborhoods emptied. And by roughly 1350, the site was essentially abandoned, and the wider region, the American Bottom, held only a fraction of its former population. So what happened? Several explanations have been proposed, and the honest answer is that the evidence supports parts of several of them and decisively confirms none. Environmental degradation. The classic version holds that Cahokia deforested its surroundings for construction timber, for palisades, for fuel, and triggered erosion and flooding that undermined its agricultural base. It's an intuitive story, but it has been directly challenged. Sediment studies in the area have been used to argue that the expected erosion signature is not clearly present, and some researchers now regard the deforestation collapse model as overstated. Flooding. The Mississippi floodplain is exactly what it sounds like. Research into flood records has identified evidence of significant flooding episodes in the relevant period, and a major flood event affecting the American Bottom would have been devastating to a city dependent on floodplain agriculture. This line of evidence has gained attention, though the precise correlation with the decline is still debated. Drought and climate shift. Tree ring and other paleoclimate records indicate changing conditions across the mid-continent in the relevant centuries, including periods of drought. Maize agriculture supporting a dense population has little margin for repeated bad years. Political and social breakdown. This explanation focuses on the institution rather than the environment. A hierarchical order that demanded enormous labor, that concentrated power and ceremonial authority, and that, as Mound 72 suggests, could exercise ultimate power over people's lives, is an order that people can decide to leave. Under this reading, the palisade is the key evidence. The city was defending itself, possibly from its own periphery. Cahokia may not have starved. It may have been rejected. Disease. Dense settlement, poor sanitation, and concentrated population create conditions for epidemic disease. Direct evidence is limited, and this remains speculative for Cahokia specifically. The current mainstream position is some combination, environmental stress interacting with political fragility in a system that had expanded very rapidly and may have lacked the resilience to absorb repeated shocks. But notice what none of these fully answer. People did not merely leave the city. The region stayed largely empty. When French explorers arrived in the late 1600s, the American Bottom held only modest populations, and the great mounds stood abandoned, their builders' identity unknown to the newcomers. Something made that landscape unattractive or unavailable or forbidden for a very long time. Which brings us to the question that hangs over everything. Who were these people and where did they go? We know they did not vanish. Populations move, they do not evaporate. The descendants of Cahokia's people are among the native nations of the mid-continent and the southeast today. The difficulty is specificity. Cahokia left no writing. Linking it to particular historic nations requires working backward through archaeology, oral tradition, and linguistic evidence, and the connections are real but not simple. Several Dagihan Siouan-speaking nations, including the Osage, Omaha, Ponca, Quapaw, and Kanza, have traditions of migration from an eastern homeland along major rivers, and researchers have argued for connections between these nations and the Mississippian world centered on Cahokia. Osage traditions in particular have been discussed extensively in this context, and some scholars have argued for meaningful continuities in cosmological structure and symbolism. Other researchers have pointed toward connections with Caddoan-speaking peoples, or emphasized that Cahokia's population was itself diverse. The strontium evidence indicates substantial numbers of non-local individuals, meaning the dispersal likely fed into multiple later nations rather than one. Today, Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a state historic site, and consultation with descendant nations has become an increasingly central part of how it is interpreted and managed. That is a significant change from the era when the mounds were farmed over, quarried for fill, and in one notorious case, partially destroyed for a subdivision. And it is worth remembering how much was lost before anyone was protecting it. St. Louis was once called Mound City, for the substantial group of mounds that stood where the downtown now is. Nearly all of them were leveled in the 1800s. What we are studying at Cahokia is a fragment of a much larger landscape that no longer exists. So what remains? An enormous artificial hill in an Illinois floodplain with a base larger than the Great Pyramids that most Americans have never heard of. A city that rose in a generation, exercised power across half a continent, built an accurate solar calendar out of cedar posts, and then walled itself in and came apart. A set of explanations for that ending, none of which is complete, and a landscape that its inhabitants left, and did not return to, for reasons we can guess at but cannot yet name. That is the honest state of it. Not a mystery invented for a documentary. A genuine open question in American archaeology being actively worked on right now about the largest city that ever stood in this part of the world before Europeans arrived. Whatever happened at Cahokia, the people who could have told us were never asked, and the ones who might still know were not listened to for a very long time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that examine forgotten history through archaeology, original records, and indigenous knowledge, consider subscribing. There are more investigations like this on the way. And before you go, I want your thoughts. What do you think emptied Cahokia? Flooding and failing harvests, or a political and religious order that people finally decided to walk away from? And why do you think a city this large in the middle of the United States is still so unknown to most people who live here? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.